This is a two-way frequency table because it shows two different categories. And it gives the number of times or the frequency with which the combinations occur. With a two-way frequency table, you can answer questions like, how many total people were surveyed? And in this case, the answer would be 30. Another question might be, of the people surveyed, how many live in a house? And the answer to that would be 18. Another thing you could say, out of everybody surveyed, what was the number of people, or with what frequency did the people live in an apartment with a pet? Apartment with a pet. And the frequency with which that happened was 4. Another type of frequency table is actually called a relative frequency table. If you think about the word relative, what is a root word in the word relative? Think about the root word of relate. So relative frequencies are going to be relating two numbers. Actually, their relative frequencies could be thought of as ratios because you're relating one number to another. For example, from the of the people surveyed, how many live in an apartment and have a pet? So out of everybody surveyed, out of the 30 people surveyed, how many people live in an apartment and have a pet? And that's 4 out of 30, which is approximately equal to 13%. So this table gives relative frequencies compared to the basic just frequency table, which just gives the straight numbers. Notice in both tables how we have different colors. Well, that's on purpose. There are 3 types of relative frequencies that we will be talking about. One type is called a marginal relative frequency, and a second type is called a joint relative frequency. Now, again, just like I did with relative, I'm going to ask you about the root words of these two descriptions. What does marginal mean? Have you ever heard of a margin? Well, if you have a piece of paper, a lot of times you'll see a red line on the left column, which is showing you the margin of the paper. Another thing that you've done is you've annotated in English class. So when you're reading your books and you're writing notes, you are annotating in the margins where you're writing your notes. So for our example here, marginal relative frequencies are ratios that relate the numbers in the margins to the total number. So in our notes here, the pink numbers are marginal relative frequencies. Now, another type of relative frequency is called a joint relative frequency. And if you look at the word here, joint, maybe the root word you could think of is joining. So joint relative frequencies are similar to the marginal relative frequencies in that they're ratios and you're relating a number to the total, grand total of people surveyed. The difference, though, is instead of just looking at the marginal numbers, for joint, we're looking at, like this example is a joint relative frequency. It joins two of the categories. Out of everybody surveyed, what's the relative frequency that they live in a house and do not have a pet? So if we join house with not having a pet, it joins right here in the interior. There were 16 out of 30, which is about 53%. We have frequency tables. There are relative frequency tables. And relative frequency can be categorized as being marginal or joint, depending on where the information is in the table, if it's in the margins or if it's in the center where you're joining two categories. And then another type that I'm going to kind of physically separate from those two, another type of relative frequency is called a conditional relative frequency. A conditional relative frequency does not use the total. Conditional relative frequencies are joint numbers divided by the marginal numbers. I'm going to go way up to our original frequency table. Let me clear it up of the notes I made. This would be an example of a conditional relative frequency. Of those who live in a house, what's the relative frequency they have a pet? So the difference between conditional and the other types of relative frequency is that you are not looking at the total, but you're looking at a certain category of the house owners. So we're only talking about 18 people there. What percent have a pet? It'd be about 11.1%, 2 out of 18. Another example of a conditional question or relative frequency would be of those who do not have a pet, what's the relative frequency? Relative, so we're going to look at a ratio. What's the relative frequency that they live in an apartment? So, of those who do not have a pet, so we are totally isolating this single row to look at. Out of the 21 people who don't have a pet, what's the percentage or relative frequency that they live in an apartment? The apartment, so it'd be 3 out of 21, which is about 1/7.